Right, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're going to unravel the absolutely fascinating psychological mystery of a man who spent his entire life lying to himself. We are, of course, looking at Kazuo Ishiguro's brilliant novel, The Remains of the Day. And we're going to explore how what seems like a simple story about an English butler is actually a complete masterclass in self-deception, historical complicity, and the really tragic cost of burying your own emotions.
Seriously, think about this for a second. How much of your own past is the actual objective truth, and how much is just a story you tell yourself to survive? It's a pretty heavy question, I know, but it's the exact puzzle we are going to piece together today. We're going to see how memory, physical space, and personal identity all collide to create one of modern literature's most compelling mysteries.
Okay, moving right into Section 1, The Perfect English Butler, The Pursuit of Dignity. Let's start by meeting Mr. Stevens. He's the relentlessly precise head butler of Darlington Hall, and he's just embarking on a really rare road trip in the summer of 1956. Now, the crucial thing to understand about Stevens is that he defines his entire existence by this extreme, almost self-denying concept of dignity. To him, being a great butler means you absolutely must repress all your personal wishes, your emotions, your opinions, everything, just to maintain flawless professional poise. And this isn't just a rule he read in an employee handbook. It's an ideology heavily inspired by his emotionally distant father, who Stevens completely idolizes. Essentially, Stevens has turned himself into a human automaton.
Because of this, his worldview is incredibly painfully narrow. Just listen to what he tells us. He says, "It has been my privilege to see the best of England over the years, sir, within these very walls." That perfectly captures how he views his highly confined life in this grand manner as the ultimate honor. He has completely cut himself off from the outside world because he genuinely believes the absolute center of the universe is his boss's living room.
Let's move on to Section 2, Anatomy of an Unreliable Narrator, Reading Between the Lines.
Now here's where it gets really fun. The author, Kazuo Ishiguro, basically turns us into detectives by giving us a narrator we absolutely cannot trust. To understand how he pulls this trick off, we can look at literary theorist Wayne Booth. Booth talked about this concept called the implied author, which is like a second self hiding behind the scenes of the text. It means we're invited to practice something called double decoding. Basically, we have to constantly weigh what Stevens formally tells us on the surface against the really tragic reality the implied author actually wants us to spot hiding in the gaps of his story.
And you see this trickery from literal page 1. Check out his completely contradictory language here. He uses words like seems, likely, and imagination. That immediately hints at this deep underlying epistemological uncertainty. Basically, he can't even trust his own grasp on reality. I mean, the guy is talking about taking a simple road trip, but his excessively careful, non-committal language tells us he is completely unsure of himself and terrified of stepping out of line.
So how does he maintain this illusion? Throughout his recollections, Stevens uses some intense psychological tools to revise his painful memories, desperately trying to protect his fragile self-image. He leans heavily on euphemisms. For instance, when Lord Darlington horrifically fires 2 Jewish maids, Stevens just brushes it off as a mere administrative matter. He uses selective memory to gloss over his employer's really dark politics, and he engages in what Sigmund Freud called secondary revision. That's when you subconsciously rebuild a deeply painful past into a safe, acceptable story so you never actually have to face your own failures or heartbreak.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, The Prison of Darlington Hall, Space and Identity.
Believe it or not, Stevens' physical environment actually engineered his intense emotional repression. Spatial criticism reveals that the strict, unbending rules of Darlington Hall functioned exactly like Michel Foucault's concept of a modern prison, specifically the panopticon. Just like an inmate who knows they might be watched at any moment and learns to police themselves, Stevens turns into this docile, self-policing subject. He completely strips away his own individuality just to conform to the rigid hierarchy and the relentless daily routine of the manor.
And even the housekeeper, Miss Kenton, calls him out on this literal repression. She actually catches him, of all things, secretly reading a romance novel in his totally bare, sparsely furnished pantry. And she says, "Really, Mr. Stevens, this room resembles a prison cell." It's just a brilliant, sad moment where the physical space perfectly mirrors his trapped, totally sterile psychological state.
The cost of surviving in this environment? It demanded ultimate, horrifying sacrifices. Just look at this stark contrast. On the surface, Stevens claims he is displaying the peak of professional dignity during a major 1923 conference. But the reality? The actual truth is that he abandoned his own dying father in another room and later completely suppressed his deep love for Miss Kenton, all just to seamlessly serve drinks to Lord Darlington and his aristocratic guests. The space demanded his complete surrender as a human being.
All right, moving into Section 4, Sunset on the Empire, a Microcosm of Britain.
Let's zoom out for a second, because Stevens' personal downward spiral perfectly mirrors the macro-level collapse of the entire British Empire. Track this parallel journey with me. Back in 1923, Darlington Hall is at the absolute peak of its global power, hosting grand international conferences. Fast forward to the 1930s, and Lord Darlington is hosting meetings that actively support appeasement and fascism. Then, by 1956, post-World War II, the Manor has completely descended into a marginalized museum piece, so diminished that an American businessman, Mr. Faraday, just buys it up.
So the big takeaway here is that Britain itself was going through a massive post-colonial identity crisis. With his global empire shrinking rapidly after World War II, the nation was suddenly marginalized. It was becoming what theorists call the other. And as a result, the country clung to this desperate nostalgia for Victorian values, which is exactly what Stevens was doing. He stubbornly clung to his outdated, rigid role as a butler, even though the modern world had completely left him behind.
And it's a crazy dynamic when you put them side by side. Lord Darlington represents unchecked aristocratic power and absolutely devastating political misjudgments. Meanwhile, Stevens represents the unquestioning everyday public. Because Stevens believed that world affairs only belonged to the nobility, his blind loyalty made him quietly complicit in Lord Darlington's darkest history. It's a really stark reminder of the immense dangers of simply following orders and assuming that the people in charge always know best.
Finally, we hit Section 5, The Remains of the Day, a Journey of Realization.
So, this 1956 road trip Stevens takes, it acts as what theorist Frederick Jameson calls cognitive mapping. It's a physical journey away from his spatial prison to rediscover his true identity. And his ultimate destination is Weymouth. Now, this isn't just some random seaside town. Weymouth was the actual launching ground for the Allied D-Day offensive against Nazi Germany. It is incredibly poignant that his long, painful journey of self-reflection ends at a geographic symbol of the Allied victory over the exact same fascism his former master once actively supported.
It's on this trip that the big moment finally happens. He meets Miss Kenton again, now Mrs. Ben, and she drops this absolute bombshell on him. She says, "For instance, I get to think about a life I might have had with you, Mr. Stevens." That single powerful sentence completely shatters Stevens's carefully constructed emotional walls. All those repressed feelings he spent a lifetime burying under the guise of dignity just come rushing to the surface.
And boom, after decades of making excuses, rewriting history, and intense self-deception, the walls finally come down. He drops the act entirely and gives us this devastatingly honest confession. Indeed, why should I not admit it? At that moment, my heart was breaking. He finally, truly acknowledges the profound tragedy of his wasted life and the love he let slip away just in the name of professional duty.
So as we reflect on the remains of Stevens's day, I want to leave you with this question to chew on. At the end of the day, how much of your life is truly yours, and how much is just blind service to the expectations of others? Are you out there living your own truth, or are you trapped in a story that was built by someone else? Definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself prioritizing duty over your own humanity. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this helped unpack a truly amazing story.